lot that we both agree on, I think, in this debate. We both believe that developed countries should share the majority of the burden. We both believe that we shouldn't impose this massive burden on developing countries who are just trying to do the best for their citizens. Where we disagree, however, is that we believe that all states have an obligation to prevent, minimize, and anticipate. We think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for developing countries to do, right? All we're saying is developing countries have this obligation to keep an eye out for future emissions. Now, what do they say? The first thing they say, I think, is that we should focus solely on consumption instead of production. First of all, advocating for such a policy does not necessarily negate a resolution, right? The second, what we tell you is, if it's right that we should focus on consumption, we can take that into account, but not use that as the full measure of policy. Why is using that as the sole measure a bad? Why is that bad? What we would first tell you is that, like, a lot of things that the United States or developed countries do is export as well, right? They export their own products to other countries, and therefore we would have them share a large burden of the cost that the United States is responsible, or that developed countries are responsible for doing. But second of all, the biggest problem is that this doesn't actually solve the problem, right? The problem is that a lot of these emissions are being generated by these countries, and therefore reducing emissions by countries that import these goods doesn't actually solve for the underlying problem, which is that these countries continue to emit, right? So let's move on to a couple of other arguments that they make, right? The first thing they say is that this distracts necessary development, right? But we tell you that they talk about developing countries as this one big entity. But what we tell you is there are differences amongst countries. That there is a vast disparity between a country like China and the problems they have, and a country like India and the problems they have. Therefore, we would utilize each goal for each country in a way that would be suitable, right? The second thing they say is that climate is secondary, and they should focus on things like pollution, sanitation, and disease. First of all, even if climate is secondary, that doesn't mean the obligation doesn't exist, and therefore this doesn't actually negate our resolution. But second, what we tell you is that focusing on climate change actually does solve for a lot of these things, right? Things like disease, we tell you, would be exacerbated if you didn't focus on climate change. Things like pollution, you would reduce if you invested in better forms of energy that don't pollute as much and have fewer carbon emissions. The second thing, the next thing they say is that a strict adherence to the principles is really, really bad. All we mean by strict adherence is that you don't cheat, right? States have an ethical obligation not to cheat on agreements that they make. An ethical obligation to make sure that they fulfill and go through with whatever comes up when, with these discussions that they end up having, right? The next thing they talk about is that energy is good and that all these trade-offs usually exist. I'd like to point out that there's a bit of tension between all these trade-offs that exist and their example of China. If it's true that China's investing and doing all these really good things, we would propose to you that example actually shows you that the trade-off doesn't necessarily exist, right? But furthermore, what we tell you is that, because China's a developing country and they're able to invest in all this, but furthermore what we tell you is insofar as these trade-offs do exist, we'd be perfectly fine with having developed countries share the majority of this burden to fund this. If it's 100 million citizens will die, we think it's a good idea for developed countries to maybe prevent some of this if the developing country is trying to pursue green energy, right? The next thing, so they say that energy is good, but there's no reason why we couldn't, they haven't given us good reasons why we couldn't focus on green energy, especially when it's specifically tailored to each country. Maybe a country that has a lot of sun, and not that many clouds would focus on more solar panels. We think that this could be individually tailored in a way that could be still maximally efficient. We think that a lot of countries have begun to do so, right? A lot of developed countries like Germany have begun to invest in these types of things, and it's been really good. And we think that other countries could follow this type of model to make them less reliant on fossil fuels. But furthermore, what we say is this also helps the state fulfill its obligation to its own citizens. Why is this the case? Because right now, states have an incentive to only focus on the present, right? For democracies, they're only accountable to people that they're voting for. But we say that they have an equally strong obligation to people in the future, because the effects of climate change are not going to only affect people right now, but also people in the future. Therefore, if you believe that there's any obligation whatsoever, we think that states also have this obligation to mitigate these adverse effects, right? The next thing they say is that we're going to impose these massively strict restrictions on Bangladesh. No, we wouldn't do so, right? What we have stressed repeatedly is we're not saying, oh, this blanket one size fits all. We just think that's not very practical because every country is different in terms of size, economic growth, and all those things. What we say is that you do have this obligation, though. We say there's this common but differentiated principle, which means that you have an ethical obligation to reduce the effects of climate change and help your own citizens to not suffer its adverse effects, right? I think that that's a fairly straightforward obligation. But why do developing countries have this obligation? I think this is where we're really winning, right? Is that they haven't really told us, because what we tell you is that developing countries will make up more and more of this. And their only thing to say is that developed countries should bear the burden of this. But first of all, what we tell you is that because these countries are enjoying the share of these profits, we would say that they have to be the ones who are at least partly responsible. But moreover, we think that overall this would just be a good idea for the state in general. Very proud to affirm this resolution.
Are you ready for cross-ex?
Sure.
How can a government whose people are starving and in some cases living on less than $1.25 a day credibly tell its citizens that it's going to spend money on new, unproven technology instead of providing for their basic material needs?
I'm going to challenge the premise of that question because these aren't unproven technologies. I don't think they're unproven technologies. And how does it do that? Even if it wasn't proven, foreign aid presumably.
What do you mean by that, foreign aid? Do you think that this is more an example of other nations helping developing countries?
I think
this should be the obligation?
I think developed countries do have an obligation to help developing countries mitigate the effects.
Yes, but why do developing countries share in that obligation when we both agree that they're facing major problems of poverty and hunger?
Yeah, first of all, I think that investing in climate change reduction also can lead to a lot of development inside the country as well. So they're fulfilling that obligation inside the country. So I don't see there's necessarily a huge trade-off to be had. I think that if you invest in things like solar panels, a lot of people can be working on those, and therefore you would create massive jobs, which is not really mutually exclusive with development in general.
Okay, massive, often high-tech jobs that some of these countries don't have the current capacity for. Have you read any evidence or cited studies as of the 1AC or 2AC that indicate that there is this economic growth potential for renewable investment?
I haven't read any, but obviously if you're trying to manufacture solar panels, I think people inside the country would be responsible for working on that, right?
Okay, that's fine. I have another question. You brought up an example of Germany getting a lot of its energy from renewable energies.
Sure.
You would agree that developing countries can learn and model already developed countries, correct?
Not with their past trajectories. I don't think it's acceptable for them to have 100 years of just destroying the earth and then later doing this. I think they should go on a more responsible trajectory. Maybe that means they have to increase emissions in the short run, but also fulfill their obligation by preventing and minimizing.
Why is it, quote, they who have destroyed the earth for 100 years, when in reality it's often Western industrialized nations who are requiring those factories to be constructed?
Because they're the ones emitting this.
Alright, I have one last...
So if I'm an assassin and I shoot someone, just because someone paid me doesn't mean I'm not responsible for murder.
Alright, that's fine. I have another question. This IPCC evidence that you're citing from the 1AC
Sure.
about the point of disease, what is a specific example of a disease that has been caused by climate change?
They haven't necessarily listed one, but I would imagine that the scarcity of clean water would probably lead to a lot of